You are listening to From Embers, a weekly show on CFRC 101.9 FM about anarchist and anti-authoritarian ideas and practice. We are broadcasting from the traditional territory of the Anishinaabe and Haudenosaunee peoples on land that has come to be called Kingston, Ontario, Canada, because of the thievery and brutality of the Canadian state and its empire-loving parents. From Embers is about fires, some real and some metaphorical. Fires started generations ago and tended to over the years. Little sparks all across this territory that we hope will grow, spread, and engulf the thieving state called Canada and the capitalist system that has plagued this land since the fur trade. Since the February 6th raid on Wet'suwet'en territory, people across the country have answered calls to shut down Canada, blocking roads, ports, bridges, and rail lines, and protesting in towns and cities across the country. Despite a recent crackdown and an Ontario provincial police invasion of the longest-lasting rail blockade at Tyendinaga Mohawk territory, people have continued shutting Canada down this week, many in defiance of court injunctions and despite police actions against them. Our last episode here on From Embers focused on the struggle on Wet'suwet'en territory itself, but I wanted to give a sense of the scale and magnitude of this moment from coast to coast. People are literally rising up. They are targeting the economy. They're doing it on reserves in the cities, in small towns, everywhere from coast to coast across so-called Canada. The government is freaking out now, and as I record this, Wet'suwet'en hereditary chiefs are in talks with provincial and federal government officials that may or may not lead to a stand-down of some sort. I wanted to highlight and celebrate just some of the shutdown actions that have been happening here this past month. But more than that, I wanted to provide a bit of context for the depth and seriousness of these actions, as well as for the intensity of the government's fears about Indigenous resistance. So I reached out to Gord Hill to chat about the 1990 Oka crisis. I'm from a settler family, and I was only 5 when warriors in Kanesatake faced off with police and military near the town of Oka for 3 months in what is now known as the Oka crisis. Settler Canadians learn about Oka as a cautionary tale, an example of the kind of violence that can occur when state-Indigenous relations go south. Liberals use it to bolster calls for peace and reconciliation, and conservatives use it to rationalize surveillance and repression of Indigenous protest. But Oka marked an important turning point for Indigenous resistance in Canada, and I wanted to talk to someone who felt inspired in 1990, as many people are feeling inspired right now as we shut down Canada. I hope Gord's words can provide a bit of insight and historical context for those of us who are feeling swept up by this surge of solidarity with the Wet'suwet'en people, and for anybody who is committed to anti-colonial resistance in general. But first, my promised shout-out to those folks shutting it down right now. I thought I'd go from east to west to highlight the regional breadth of this thing. We talk probably too much about Ontario and Quebec here on From Embers, and the focus in the mainstream media has been a lot on Tyendinaga Mohawk territory this past week. But here is a sampling of what else has been going on. Starting from the East Coast and heading west. On February 27th, protesters built a pipeline through the office of Natural Resources Minister Seamus O'Regan in St. John's, Newfoundland. On February 22nd, 150 people slowed the road leading from the mainland of Nova Scotia to the Canso Causeway into Cape Breton. On February 11th, 100 people blocked the rail lines and the entry to a container port in Halifax, Nova Scotia. On February 28th, Mi'kmaq warriors blocked the rail line in Truro, Nova Scotia. On February 16th, Mi'kmaq people on so-called Prince Edward Island slowed traffic on the Confederation Bridge. On February 21st, Mi'kmaq from Elsipogtog blocked the CN mainline for 72 hours near Moncton, New Brunswick, and later near Harcourt, New Brunswick. For 2 weeks, beginning February 12th, members of the Listugush Mi'kmaq Nation have blocked a rail line used to haul lumber across their territory. As far as I know, they are still there. On February 16th in Saint Pascal, February 21st in Ile Verte, and on February 24th in Rimouski, demonstrators held one-day rail blockades. On February 25th, demonstrators again blocked the railway, this time in Sherbrooke, Quebec, in defiance of a province-wide court injunction. In Saint-Lambert, a suburb on Montreal's South Shore, about 100 people held down the railway tracks for 2 days on February 19th and 20th. In Kahnawake, Mohawks have blocked a section of Canadian Pacific Rail since February 25th. When presented with a Quebec court injunction, they only reinforced their blockade with concrete barricades and other materials. They are also still there. On February 2nd, Kanesatake Mohawks held a rolling highway slowdown, and on February 24th, they blockaded Route 344, which connects their territory and the village of Oka to the island of Montreal and other highways. On February 18th, angered by their band chief's denunciation of the blockades, community members barricaded the band council office, leading to a detraction and apology from the chief. On February 7th, Akwesasne Mohawks closed the Seaway International Bridge. On February 11th, Mohawks from Akwesasne slowed traffic on Highway 401, North America's busiest highway, with a rolling blockade. On February 10th to 12th, the Department of Justice was occupied for 2 full days in Ottawa, after which protesters spilled out and blocked rush hour traffic in the capital. In small town Perth, Ontario, 30 people occupied their MP's office for a whole day. On February 19th, protesters from Kingston closed the Thousand Islands International Bridge, resulting in the closure of a major border crossing for 3 hours and snarling traffic both on Highway 401 and in upstate New York. On February 9th, also in Kingston, protesters held a 2-hour protest on the railroad tracks. On February 27th, they did it again at a different crossing, closing the recently reopened rail line for an additional 3 hours in defiance of a province-wide court injunction after the raid at Tyendinaga. In Tyendinaga, Mohawk territory, a more than 2-week rail shutdown was broken up by provincial police on February 24th. Camps remain there now alongside the railway tracks, and Mohawks say the fight is not over until Wet'suwet'en hereditary chiefs are satisfied that the RCMP have left their territory. In Peterborough, Ontario, a 24-hour occupation of a Liberal MP's office was held on February 12th. In Toronto, rail lines were blocked 4 times, on February 8th, 15th, and twice on February 25th, when protesters managed to block freight and commuter trains for 24 hours, despite a court injunction and despite repeated police attempts to clear the rails. In Hamilton, Ontario, people closed a major rail junction for 24 hours on February 24th to 25th, following another brief rail shutdown in central Hamilton on February 2nd. On February 16th, people closed the Rainbow International Bridge in Niagara Falls for an afternoon. On February 24th, Mohawks from Six Nations and some supporters closed Highway 6 for several days. On February 28th, demonstrators closed the railway tracks in London for part of a day, again in defiance of a province-wide injunction. Highway 17 across northern Ontario was blocked on February 17th by several different coordinated road slowdowns. On February 24th, Indigenous protesters and supporters blocked an entrance to the International Bridge in Sault Ste. Marie. The CN rail line was blocked near Winnipeg on February 12th. On February 24th, demonstrators near Winnipeg blocked the Trans-Canada Highway. CP rail line near Saskatoon has been blocked since February 22nd and, as far as we know, remains closed. On February 19th, a one-day rail blockade west of Edmonton, Alberta, was broken up by right-wing counter-demonstrators after refusing to obey a court injunction. In Nelson, BC, protesters closed a Bank of Montreal branch for 2 days on February 11th and 12th. The rail line on Neskamouth First Nation east of Kamloops has been blocked several times. A busy nearby highway was also shut down on February 20th, and another rail blockade was set up near there in Chase, BC, by Secwepemc land defenders. Gitson land defenders blocked a rail line near New Hazelton, BC for more than a week before taking it down, pending negotiations with Wet'suwet'en chiefs and the provincial and federal governments. The rail line was reoccupied on February 24th, following the police raid in Tyendinaga, resulting in several arrests. Near Vancouver, rail lines have been shut down temporarily on at least 3 separate occasions. Protesters vow to continue the fight and say that these blockades will continue until the Wet'suwet'en chiefs are satisfied. The Delta port in downtown Vancouver has also been shut down numerous times, including at least once for several days. On Vancouver Island, numerous protests and road shutdowns have been held, and the ferry to mainland BC has been shut down a number of times. And that's just a sampling. There have been huge protests in every major city, large protests in small towns where it's hard to believe that 100 people would come out for such a thing, and a bunch of sabotage actions of rail lines and other infrastructure. Any one of these actions might warrant an entire episode of this show on a normal week, but this is not normal. Business as normal has been literally shut down. Shutdown Canada has grown and swelled, and it is showing no signs of stopping. People are resolute and committed to continuing this fight, at least until Wet'suwet'en chiefs feel that they have been heard and listened to, and that the RCMP have cleared their territory as they've demanded. This comes just about a year after another wave of Shutdown Canada actions in support of the same struggle last January, after another RCMP raid on the Unicertain camp and the Gadinden camp, also on Wet'suwet'en territory, and years of struggle by land defenders across Turtle Island, including but not limited to the more than 10 years of struggle by the Unicertain camp on Wet'suwet'en territory, supported by Indigenous people and allies across the country who are increasingly normalizing the idea that when land defenders are attacked on their territory, we target the economy, we shut Canada down. It's absolutely not the first time, and it absolutely won't be the last. And in that spirit, I bring you this interview with Gord Hill talking about Oka in 1990.
Okay, my name is Gord Hill. I'm from the Kwakwaka'wakw Nation on the Pacific Northwest coast of so-called Canada, and I'm an author of 500 Years of Resistance graphic novel published by Arsenal Pulp Press, and recently the Antifa comic book.
And can you, for our listeners, many of whom are probably settlers born after 1990, just quickly explain what happened at Kanesatake in 1990?
Okay, in 1990, it's called the Oka crisis because it's named after the town of Oka, which is adjacent to the Kanesatake Mohawk territory. And I think beginning in the fall of 1989, the township wanted to expand a golf course and build a condominium project right next to this area called the Pines, which was like a forested area in Kanesatake. They have their graveyard is there. So a lot of people in Kanesatake, as well as Oka, organized protests in that to stop this golf course expansion and the condominium development. And these protests went on for a few months. And the Mohawks in Kanesatake erected a little blockade on basically like a dirt road that was hardly used at all. And they had the blockade for a few months. And then the Quebec government sent in the Sûreté de Québec, which was the Quebec provincial police. They sent in the police to remove this little blockade. And they went in with a lot of riot police, but also heavily armed tactical unit. And what had happened in Kanesatake was they had been making call-outs for people to come and help them. And so one of the main groups that responded to their call for help was warrior societies, Mohawk warrior societies from Kakwaka'wakw, Akwesasne, and whatnot. So there was... The police made the raid on July 11th, 1990, and it turned into a firefight with a lot of rounds being fired. And in this exchange of gunfire, a police officer was shot and killed. And this set in motion a 77-day armed standoff between the Mohawk Nation and initially the police, but then eventually the Canadian Armed Forces deployed a mechanized infantry brigade comprised of about 4,500 soldiers with armored vehicles and tanks and whatnot. So this standoff went on for 77 days, all through this summer and into late September of 1990. And it was a huge watershed moment in Canadian history. It served to reignite the warrior spirit, warrior culture, the fighting spirit of Indigenous peoples across Canada. And at the time, there was a lot of widespread solidarity actions with the Mohawks. In Kakwaka'wakw, they blockaded the Mercier Bridge and were themselves engaged in an armed standoff during this entire time as well. And in the end, the Gulf. On September 27th, I think it was, the warriors in Ganasutagi laid down burned their weapons and attempted to walk out of the area that they had been holding, and a number of them were eventually arrested at the time and afterwards. But eventually, the golf course was never built, and the condominium expanded, and the condominium project was never built. So that was a victory for the Mohawks, and that's basically what happened in 1990.
And where were you? What was your personal experience of the summer of 1990?
Well, at the time, I was actually, I traveled to Germany and other parts of Europe initially when the standoff occurred. And then when I got back, it was still going on, and I was in Toronto, so I helped organize and participate in a lot of solidarity rallies and stuff like that. And then I came back to the West Coast, Vancouver, where I was living at the time, and continued to organize solidarity rallies. And then we organized solidarity, like fundraising benefits, and there was a speaking tour with the Mohawks afterwards as well. So we organized those types of events. So basically helped with, solidarity work and getting information out.
And what were some of the kinds of actions that were happening, like outside of the Oka area at the time?
Well, initially it began with a lot of highway blockades across the country, and then train blockades. There was occupations of different government offices, and then there was also sabotage actions, like there was power lines that were cut down in southern Ontario. There was railway bridges that were burned and whatnot. So that's basically the type of thing happened. And there was a lot of solidarity rallies with like hundreds and even thousands of people. And I think some of the biggest solidarity rallies occurred in Montreal, which is very close to Ganasutagi and Kahnawake. And I think they had like 10,000 people marching in solidarity with the Mohawks and that. And this was despite the fact that a police officer had been shot and killed. So, a lot of people supported the Mohawks in their stand. That was the type of solidarity stuff that occurred.
And what do you think was the impact of those outside actions, like on the Mohawk struggle, but also on the people in those places who were taking part in that?
I think, the solidarity actions were very important because it really restrained the Canadian state's ability to simply go in and use military force, because they were obviously facing a potential Indigenous insurgency across the country if they had continued to go in and really use a lot of military violence to try to subdue the Mohawks. So I think it was very, very important. It radicalized a lot of Indigenous people across the country, and the standoff set the tone for Indigenous resistance all through the 1990s, even through the 2000s, and even up until today, because you still see the Mohawk warrior flag, which really gains prominence during the Oka standoff, and we still see that flying today at all the train blockades that are occurring today in February 2020. So, in terms of that, I think the solidarity is very, very important. It's the same situation today with the Unistan. It's the solidarity actions that have, really made this a national issue. So it's very important, and for the people involved in these actions, like for the warriors in Ganasutagi or for the Wet'suwet'en up in the Unistan territory, this type of solidarity is very important. It's very empowering. It's inspiring. It helps motivate people to continue going forward, even when they're under like harsh conditions, facing police violence and whatnot. This type of solidarity is very important, and I think it's the same situation today.
And what about, what does it do for people who are participating in those actions elsewhere? Like, how are you feeling while that standoff was going on, taking part in stuff, outside of Ganasutagi?
Well, I think a lot of Native people were really inspired. It was a really powerful time, and to see this imagery, because at the time the state hadn't really gotten its counterinsurgency strategy down. Like, they didn't really have a plan how to deal with this. So there was extensive media coverage, which is something that they imposed greater control over at actions that occurred after Oka in 1990. But at the time, there was extensive media coverage. The imagery of armed warriors confronting soldiers I mean, this was all very, had occurred, came to the conclusion that one of the problems that Canada faced with this standoff was that they deployed the deployment of the military, this massive military force against these lightly armed warriors, gave the Mohawks a moral victory in the eyes of the public. And so this was something that they wanted to avoid in future conflicts. So in 1995, when we had the standoffs at Ipperwash and Gustafson Lake here in British Columbia, Ipperwash being in southern Ontario, I mean, the state's counterinsurgency strategy at the time, they learned from Oka, so they had a lot of media control, a lot of restrictions on media access to the zone of conflict, and then they sent in heavily armed police with military assistance rather than just sending in a military force. So, I mean, that's some of the lessons that the state learned from the standoff.
What do you think people learned who were participating in the struggles?
Well, I think they learned, I mean, one thing about the Mohawks and the Haudenosaunee, the Six Nations Confederacy, I mean, one thing I think a lot of people took away from that was this idea of a sovereign nation. Like, what is a sovereign nation? Because there's a lot of talk about Indigenous sovereignty in that. But I think the Mohawks really, the Haudenosaunee overall, but in particular the Mohawks, they really showed, one aspect of a sovereign nation is the ability to defend its territory. And a part of that is the idea that warrior societies, the role of the warrior, I think was, kind of re-examined, and the idea that the warrior is there that's the force you have that can actually physically defend the territory. So I think these were some lessons that came out of Oka, and I mean, the idea of armed resistance, being, it really demonstrated that a community that has organization and the capability can engage in armed resistance. And even today, this is kind of playing out in Kahnawake. I mean, I know the Mohawks in Kahnawake are really pushing back against the Quebec premier who said that the reason the Sûreté de Quebec aren't going into Kahnawake right now to dismantle the train blockade, which has been in place since February 8th in solidarity with the Unistoten. The reason that the police haven't gone in is because of the presence of AK-47s in the community. And I know there's a lot of pushback against this by the Mohawks because one thing the Quebec Premier's statements do is it kind of creates the context for a heavily armed intervention into Kahnawake. But on the other hand, I mean, one of the things from that even is that if your community has this capability of resistance, then the state is going to be far more reluctant to try to go in and remove, for example, a train blockade or whatever. So, I mean, these are some things I think that Indigenous people are still kind of. These things have to be relearned over and over again as well because you have the passage of generations in that. And I mean, Oka was 30 years ago now, but I think it still really resonates, as the standoff, the historical importance of it. I think it still really resonates. But I think going back to the idea, this is what Indigenous sovereignty is. It's the ability to defend your territory. So I think that's one of the main lessons I think people would have learned from that.
In September 1990, when people stood down at Oka, did that feel like a moment of victory for people who'd been participating in those actions? Did you feel that was a victory at the time?
Well, I think at that point, I mean, this had been 77 days, so it's over 2 months. So you're almost approaching a 2.5 month mark. And the thing with these kind of long drawn out campaigns, these things is you kind of have attrition comes in because how long can you sustain? How long can this keep going? It was kind of like a stalemate. I mean, because of the widespread solidarity and support for the Mohawks, the military was really restrained in what it could do, and it had begun closing in the perimeter of the warriors, and they ended up in a treatment center in Kanesatake, and that was kind of like their last stand. All the other barricades and all this area that they'd controlled had been reduced to this very small perimeter, and there was ongoing daily kind of confrontations between warriors and soldiers. And in a sense, I mean, it had kind of played out. So by September 27th, when the warriors burnt their weapons in a big fire and attempted to walk out because they weren't surrendering, that was kind of like a point that they'd wanted to make. They were simply withdrawing, right, standing down, as it were. So, I mean, it didn't really feel like a victory because of this kind of stalemate situation. But I think there was generally relief that this thing was now over. And the victory had already been obtained, which, in my mind, bigger than what the Mohawks were trying to do to defend their land there. The victory had already been gained through this this inspiring of warrior culture, this idea of warrior societies, this idea of Indigenous resistance. I think that had already been established. So when they actually withdrew on September 27th. I think, it was just kind of more like a relief. This thing's done now, and we can learn from this resistance that we've just experienced, and we can move forward now. So that was kind of my feeling. And then afterwards, you kind of realize, later on, this was a victory because the goals that they had set, which was to stop the golf course expansion, to stop the condominium development, were achieved. But it wasn't clear at the time, and what was going to happen. But over time, then you realize, okay, this was a victory. It worked. They achieved their objective.
You are listening to From Embers, your weekly anarchist radio show here on CFRC 101.9 FM in Kingston, or you might be listening to the podcast edition of From Embers, which comes out somewhat more irregularly on your favorite podcatching apps. And this week you are listening to my interview with Gord Hill on the Oka crisis and its legacy and lessons it might hold for those involved with Shutdown Canada today. But first, a song requested by Gord. This is Here Come the Warriors by Iroquois.
Here comes the warrior. Here comes the warrior. Stand up and fight for your freedom. Uprise for your freedom. Warfare without disguise. Live or die for your freedom. Sound off the battle cry. Warriors ride to meet them. Forever my people on the righteous eyes will defeat them. Ready to start cooking the beef. Armed to the teeth with verses like a samurai to cut up a thief. To reveal just what he's made of. Inside out. Stripped raw vigilante law. Flesh dries out. No fear, blood curling. Screams and shout. Conviction stands beyond a reasonable doubt. Look for his whereabouts. Search high and low. Calling all foes from the intro. Prepare to burn slow. For the war crimes committed. Punchline submitted. Won't be permitted to get away or quit it. They gon' regret it, yo. Enemies coming like dead men walking. Better tell them we the warriors and we're done talking. Let's go. Here comes the warriors riding high with the sun. Warriors magnify Yahweh. The glorious, the brave become victorious. Warriors. Here comes the warriors riding high with the sun. Warriors magnify Yahweh. The glorious, the brave become victorious. Warriors. Take up your battle shield. They don't want harmony. They want the battlefield for the trap, causing you harm with these. They want to spit venom frequently, and when it moves right, they want to slice you peacefully. These so-called MC, most all MC, living a lie as if you still ball MC. You is wicked, so get ready to fall MC. I shouldn't have to write your name up on the wall. MCs, warriors, armor on. We kicking down doors till the early morn. Catch us rapping on tours, and the soldiers of light now fight for yours. One God, one sword, one war, one Lord, once more. Here comes the warriors riding high with the sun. Warriors magnify Yahweh. The glorious, the brave become victorious. Warriors. Come on, think about it. Do you really want a war with us? Thinking that war is just battle runs versus fancy choruses running toward us. The war forces us into metamorphosis. Release the Christ forcing us. Of course, he's the source in us. Who knew? A chosen few is poor as us. Would be counted righteous with a double-edged sword for war. Forward thrust. We're still battling what you're most fearing. This atmosphere, nothing but winter circling round here. Living and moving and breathing and having our being, believing, receiving anointing before we leaving for war play. War play. All day and sword play. Every day, all day. He's looking for warriors. Unafraid when the enemy raids. Not stop attacking with his wicked wicked ways of play, so you're confused and amazed. But see how the serpent decays as we praise. Look out, up there.
Here comes the warriors riding high with the sun. Warriors magnify Yahweh, the glorious, the brave become victorious. Warriors. Here comes the warriors riding high with the sun. Warriors magnify Yahweh, the glorious, the brave become victorious. Warriors. Here comes the warriors. Here comes the warriors. Here comes the warriors. Here comes the warriors.
Do you personally, the media has been drawing a lot of parallels between the moment we're in right now with the Wet'suwet'en struggle out west and Oka. Do you personally see any parallels between these two moments? And if so, what are they?
I mean, in a really broad way, yeah. It's another Indigenous land defense campaign mobilization occurring. I don't really see it as being another Oka, though, because if you look at the Wet'suwet'en and the Unistoten situation, I mean, you just don't see the same level of resistance that was seen at Ganasutagi and Kahnawake. There's very different types of community dynamics. It's not an armed resistance. It's very low-level civil disobedience. I mean, that's basically what the Wet'suwet'en and their allies engaged in up at Unistoten and Gidimt'en. Oka is very different. It's armed standoff. Shots fired. This type of thing. Military is deployed. It's not so much that there's strong parallels between today and Oka 1990. But one thing about today is that it's really informed by what happened in Oka 1990. And this is the reason why, for example, the Tyendinaga blockade, train blockade, lasted for as long as it did. I think it was 2 weeks. And it's the specter of Oka that has enabled the Kahnawake blockade to persist for as long as it has as well. And you had the federal Indigenous Services Minister, or whatever he's called now, actually invoke the specter of Oka as to why the police weren't just going in willy-nilly and forcefully dismantling some of these train blockades that were occurring. Because, the federal government is saying, we're not going in and smashing these blockades right now because we're concerned about another potential Oka situation, which could lead us into an Indigenous insurgency. So I think the present campaign that's going on today with solidarity with the Wet'suwet'en is really informed by what happened in Oka 1990, and it's part of the reason why these train blockades have been able to persist and why they were able to carry them out. And I think a lot of the people who are involved in these train blockades probably may not even realize this history and why the train blockades were able to be carried out for so long. And I've seen there's some aspects of this mobilization occurring that are trying to police the movement and say, this is all peaceful, non-violent civil disobedience. And for the most part, that's true. But any little sign of militancy you see kind of come up, like with the Tyendinaga Mohawks, once their blockade was dismantled, they're putting burning tires on the train tracks. They put a car on the tracks and set that on fire. And then you have some of the people that are involved in this Unistoten solidarity thing saying, those are agent provocateurs, those are undercover police agents doing this. So there's still this kind of weird dynamic of this kind of pacifist ideology that still persists, and you can still see it sprout up once in a while. Whereas in Oka 1990, I mean, you had no discussion about this pacifism type of thing. It was clearly understood. This is armed standoff. This is armed resistance. This is what's happening. This isn't some pacifist, nonviolent civil disobedience thing. And I think that's a big difference between today and Oka 1990 as well. But I mean, certainly this movement, you do see a lot more militancy, especially compared to Idle No More. I mean, Idle No More also contributes to the situation we have today because it helped mobilize thousands of Indigenous people across the country in 2012, 2013. But it had a really strong pacifist kind of overtone and a lot of policing of the movement. So this is kind of something different today because it's kind of got a little bit of militancy, but it's also kind of got this real nonviolent civil disobedience vibe to it. So yeah.
I think there's this kind of growing sense that that is kind of, it feels new to me, like as a young person, that what we should do like elsewhere when land defenders are attacked is target the economy, and that's the whole like shut down Canada hashtag thing. Obviously that also happened in 1990. Do you think that's a good thing? Do you think it's a useful thing? Like, what do you think about that?
Well, I think in Oka, during Oka 1990, you didn't really have, it was like so scattered. I mean, it wasn't really a thing of like this national action of direct actions like with the train blockades. I mean, what we're seeing today is unprecedented because it did not occur on this scale. Now, Native people have been blockading trains for decades now, and there's some communities that have done this, fairly often. Tyendinaga is one, but Chiam in the Fraser Valley, just outside Vancouver, I mean, they targeted train tracks running through their res fairly often as well. But today, like this, I mean, the scale of this kind of direct action is unprecedented, and I think, I mean, it's going to be a tactic that people are going to resort to in the future, no doubt. And one thing about the Shut Down Canada slogan is I think it actually appeared first in like 2007, because at the time the Assembly of First Nations, which is like a national organization for the Indian Act Band Council chiefs, the Assembly of First Nations called for a day of action. And so a lot of us at the grassroots, we were like, no, we're not going to participate in this. The AFN is just going to pretend that it's like some kind of opposition when it's actually just like, a puppet thing for the government. But some grassroots people actually did decide to participate in it, including the Tyendinaga Mohawks, and they blockaded the railway at that time. But that's when Shut Down Canada became like a slogan, because this idea, there was an understanding. I mean, for a few decades now, there's been an understanding that Canada is vulnerable to this type of direct action. You could actually seriously disrupt the economy by blockading trains and ports and highways. So this isn't something new. It's been talked about for quite a long time now. It's just that today there was, I mean, one thing about the Unistat, I think they did a lot of outreach. I mean, they've been organizing for almost 10 years to stop various pipelines. This is just the latest pipeline that's actually gone through with construction. So the Unistat have years of networking and organizing events. They've been back and forth across the country numerous times, doing public speaking and organizing with people and that. So I think a lot of credit goes to them as well, that you see the response, the fairly widespread response from Indigenous people and non-Indigenous people across the country. So, yeah, I mean, I think in the future, going forward, we're going to see this tactic used again. It's the realization of a slogan that was like, 15 years ago or so, it was kind of developed, and, people thought this was something that's viable, and now we see that it can actually occur. And another lesson about it is like, I mean, initially there was just like, I think there was like half a dozen blockades, and CN and Via Rail were already announcing that they were shutting down major parts of their network because some of these blockades were hitting like major lines. Like the Tyendinaga one really causes a major disruption to the train system in Ontario. So there's this, we can see that just a small amount of blockades can cause significant problems for Canada. I mean, and in combination with the port blockades. So now you have container ships lining up in Vancouver waiting to load cargo because it's been delayed. You have trains lined up waiting to move because they've been stalled for like a couple of weeks now. So very significant. And this is just, I mean, a lot of these blockades kind of, they're just like up for a few hours and then they're gone. But you have the linchpin like Tyendinaga was, or there was one in Kahnawake, these types of things. So I think there's a lot of lessons to be learned from it, and we're going to be processing this information for a while after this all kind of clears out. But I'm sure this tactic will be used again in the future for sure.
There's like thousands, if not hundreds of thousands of people who've come out for this moment and probably felt pretty inspired and activated by this campaign. What do you think people should do with all that energy and momentum? Like, if there are stand downs, if it is over, like, what should happen next with all of that?
I mean, it's hard to say. I mean, movements come and go. They rise and they fall. It's just like, this is just like life. Life has ups and downs, so the movement experiences similar ups and downs. Like right now we're at an up, I mean, inevitably it's going to decline. And I think that's the time when you want to reflect and, think about what you've done and, what was effective, what wasn't effective, how did the state respond, how could we have reacted differently. So I think that'll take time. We need the downtime to think. So I think that's probably what will happen. People will reflect on this and try to learn from it. I mean, it's not over yet because, we're starting now in negotiations with the federal and provincial ministers. There's all this talk about they want RCMP out of Wet'suwet'en territory. I think there's some confusion about the message, what is the actual demand? I mean, initially it was to stop the Coastal GasLink pipeline, and then in this process it became we want RCMP out of Wet'suwet'en territory. I don't know if they actually mean out of Uwist'ot'en and Gidimt'en territory, because that's where the police are patrolling on the Forest Service Road. But, I mean, you can't just keep a campaign going indefinitely because you're going to suffer attrition. It's inevitable. It's going to decline at some point. So I think that, it's natural. What's going to happen is, it's going to decline. People are going to stand down and learn and reflect on what's happened here. And, and I think there's a lot of networks that have been established or expanded. I think there's a lot more people involved in this big mobilization now, and I think it's really interesting. And you see a lot of young Indigenous people who've become radicalized, and now they're mobilized, and so they're going to be. They're going to be building things, so it's, it's impossible to say what's going to happen, but, it's obviously had a major impact, and we're going to see the effects of this for the next few years, definitely.
Do you think things felt better in 1991 for your movements than they had in 1989? Was there an increase in energy because of what happened at Oka, or was it negative?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, definitely. I mean, through the 80s you had... it was weird in the 70s, of course, you had the grassroots, militant, indigenous resistance happening, American Indian movement, you had warrior societies and stuff like that, armed blockades and that. And then by the 1980s, a lot of the band councils had kind of adopted the tactic of the blockade, and they kind of reduced them to these, nonviolent civil disobedience actions with orchestrated arrests, with the police and stuff like that. We've seen that in Haida Gwaii and other areas where band councils started adopting this technique, and then through the 80s, we kind of got bogged down in this constitutional reform debate, national debate that went on, and then you had the Gitxsan and the Wet'suwet'en actually were engaged in the Delgamuukw, court case that went on for years. And, it just really was an exciting time if you were like a warrior involved in Indigenous resistance. There were some things happening, but it just wasn't really the thing. But after 1990, the landscape completely changed. You actually had a serious Indigenous resistance and people talking about, how to resist and stuff like that, anti-colonial analyses, understanding of colonization. That's the impact that things like Oka can have. And, that's why the state is so concerned about this, especially in Canada, where Indigenous people can have such a major impact on the nation state. So, I think that's... it's kind of a different situation now because we've had years of organizing and mobilizing occurring. Elsipogtog, Six Nations, Idle No More, different things like this. So it's not the same as the 80s, and then 1990 comes along. And then the Uwist'ot'en Solidarity thing isn't like Oka 1990. It's kind of it's almost like a direct action civil disobedience campaign. So there's a lot of differences. And Oka had a major impact because it was such a high level of resistance that was being engaged in. And what had preceded it through the 80s was this really low point. So after Oka 1990, things really got going. It was really a lot of stuff happening. And like I mentioned, this thing of Oka, it still has an impact today. This Uwist'ot'en thing is going to have an impact as well. I don't think on the same kind of scale, though, but it's definitely going to inform future struggles that are going to occur.
Do you have a favorite story or moment from 1990 that you felt particularly inspired by, like a particular day or action that took place that really you think of when you think about that moment? I think one thing, it wasn't really a moment or anything, but
there was one of the warriors. His code name was Blackjack, I think. Joe David. He's passed away now, but he was he was an artist, a thinker. He got involved in the campaign at Ganasatagi. He lived in Ganasatagi. He was a Mohawk. He got involved in the campaign against the golf course expansion and the condominium development, and he was actually a pacifist. And then when the Sûreté de Quebec did the raid on July 11th, and there was all this shootout and that. I mean, apparently one of the warriors abandoned their rifle and took off, and Joe David picked up that rifle and engaged in this armed standoff for the next 77 days or whatever. So to me, that really struck me afterwards, because as a resistance movement, we have these internal debates and struggles about things, and to me, this idea that this guy was he's really committed pacifist, he didn't believe in this armed resistance stuff, but then once it happened, once he was confronted with state violence, he picked up the weapon and made his stand. So to me, that was that's a really powerful kind of story. And to me, it wasn't a big part of the Oka story or anything, but to me, I just felt that it's an important story, I think, and it always kind of had an impact on me. I think that was an important one. I mean, another, I think the most striking imagery that came from Oka was actually from that July 11th raid, and seeing the police, retreat, abandon their vehicles, those vehicles used to make barricades. I mean, this type of imagery, I mean, yeah, that along with Joe David, I think that imagery of the police abandoning their vehicles, retreating, that's empowerment. So, yeah, I would say that.
You got anything else that you would want to say to people who are out there who are involved in actions or campaigns right now that you would like them to hear you say about that moment, about what we should learn from that history?
I mean, it's good to learn from the history because that informs the present. That it's how we got to be in the situation that we're in today. That history is really important to know. To the people today, I mean, you're contributing to this history of resistance. So, more power to you.
Look here, old chap. It's us who gave you civilization. Invasion. If a man in your house told you to come out and told you to live in the garden, if it happened to you, tell me what would you do? Wouldn't you fight and fight and fight them? Those old Europeans, they had a lot of man. They went over to other people's land to conquer was their intention. Those old Europeans, they had a lot of man. They went over to America to try conquer the Red Indian. Well, I don't know about you, but I tell you what I do when I am looking at a Western. When I'm watching a telly, I don't really see the Red Indian as a real bad man. They had a lot to give cause they didn't want to live in a little old dirty reservation. Cause they didn't care cause they were just there defending their own homeland. Europeans come not one by one but in their tens and thousands with the intention of taking all the best land and giving the Indian the bad one. Well, you must understand that the Red Indian were not just savages or madman, cause I am aware that they were just there reacting like any human. If a man in your house told you to come out and told you to live in the garden, if it happens to you, tell me what would you do? Wouldn't you fight and fight and fight them? If a man in your house told you to come out and told you to live in the garden, if it happened to you, tell me what would you do? Wouldn't you fight and fight and fight them? Those old Europeans, they had a lot of man. They went over to other people's land to conquer was their intention. Those old Europeans, they had a lot of man. They went over to South Africa to try conquer the South African. Cecil Rhodes and the posse of European did come with African land. They came for a fight with a gun in them right and them Bible in the left hand. They treated us with enough disgust. Never treat we like man and woman. Treated us like something from outer space, like something that you wouldn't spit on. We were first class citizens in Africa, they made us second class citizens. It is mad and bad and so sad to be a prisoner in your own land. But me people are fighting for the truth and the rights, and the truth and the rights must stand. So that system apartheid must be destroyed, and it can't carry on too long. If a man come in your house and told you to come out and told you to live in the garden, if that happens to you, tell me what would you do? Wouldn't you fight and fight and fight them? If a man in your house told you to come out and told you to live in the garden, if it happened to you, tell me what would you do? Wouldn't you fight and fight and fight them? Those old Europeans, they had a lot of man. They went over to other people's land to conquer was their intention. Those old Europeans were very cheeky man. They would turn round and say that they gave us civilization. Hear them now? Look here, old chap, it's us who gave you civilization. If it wasn't for us, you'd be running around without any clothes on. We taught you to eat with a knife in the right and a fork in your left hand. If it wasn't for us, you'd be fighting with spears instead of with shotgun. We think your gold and silver is sufficient payment for bringing you out of the past and right into the present. You owe a lot to us, I'm sure you're in agreement. So anything we say to do, just do it and keep silent. These so-called civilized man did come with them big weapon. Kill off tiger, elephant, rhinoceros and lion. Then put them head in a dining room for decoration. Now tell me, does that sound like a civilized person? Those old Europeans, they had a lot of man. They went over to other people's land to conquer was their intention. Those old Europeans were very clever man. They always made it seem like that they weren't the righteous one. Cause everybody in ya have a television, and each and everybody must have seen Tarzan. You know the one where you see old for African, looking kinda mean with them war paint on. And from one tree, sung a white man a show, oh, 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 like any madman. And with one dry piece of knife in the man, and kill on the African one by one. Well, me and you know it's imagination, but to some people this is confusion. It's just another trick, a diversion, created by the grand old European. Those old Europeans, they had a lot of man. They went over to other people's lands to conquer was their intention. Those old Europeans, they had a lot of man. They went over to America, went over to South Africa, went over to India, went over to Australia, went over to Canada, went over to Jamaica, went.
machine must have been invented, cause it feels like we're back in a time where all the shit was accepted. Or maybe it was past generations that passed it down to the next kid. So can I really blame the kids?
Nope.
Or is it the parents? Yeah. That taught them they're not the same color of skin. You walk in, they go judge their appearance. My mom would be embarrassed, man. If I was that guy. True. Supremacy lines, no one bats and nines. Standing rock, police arriving, everybody lose their mind. Man, it's fucked up, but we rock solid and up shook. And we good like Mama Ma'o's cookbook. You can't be stuck up in the middle, cause there ain't no such thing as halfway crooks. Nah, 3Ks in America and KK Canada. That's Trump True don't when them true colors show. I'm just clearing the smoke in the air. That ain't nothing new though.
Nope.
Isn't that true though?
True.
If I rock a Caucasian tee, you would feel a little bit of that. Thought so. Are we the land of the free or the land of the imprisoned? Low key. I guess it comes down to your POV. Let's just agree to disagree. That all lives matter. All lives matter. Yeah. Until we cut out all the bullshit, there'll always be 3Ks in Canada. I see you on the street. KK Canada. I see you with the police. KK Canada. I see you on my newsfeed. KK Canada. I see you on the club scene. KK Canada. I see you at the red light. KK Canada. I see you in the bar fight. KK Canada. My life and my ride. All of that matters. Tell you the truth, man. I just want my Canada.
If I had a daughter and I had to give her up, what you gonna do? We gon' make it count. Damn right. 2017 and you call them blacks. Don't do it. What you call them? What's that about? I don't know. I stand with my sisters, I'll stand with my brothers. Yeah. No doubt. This racial cleanse just brought up a number. Power to the people, never count us out. My brothers and sisters, this the resistance. Our energies fearless, they fearing our spirits. Our enemy spirits, feel we inferior. How can like a element make them superior? The building was built on bodies enslaved. Your freedom provided by people in chains. Leave it in the past, but I'm hearing them say our country's the greatest. No way. Mask off, show your face, bitch. The KKK turned the closet racist. Filled with hatred is an understatement. That's the rise of the brain dead from mama's base. You were taught to hate, you can learn to love. Like the chronicles of OJ, I see her true colors. Blacks doing thug shit, Nate's doing chuck shit. You say you're not a bigot, but the glove fits. Just now I'm sick and tired of these fucking tyrants. When it hits the fan, who stands beside us? We can't be silent, you'll never divide us. No blood in the soil of the land we provide. No love lost, no. Tell me what you've been through. No one knows. You try to kill us off, what's your excuse? What? Black lives matter, if you don't understand it, keep quiet, bitch. Look at the pattern, equality's lost. Check please. Don't patronize me, we need equity. Rest in power, Miss Heather Higher, we fired up. The name is Canada. I see you on the street. KK Canada. I see you with the police. KK Canada. I see you on my newsfeed. KK Canada. I see you on the club scene. KK Canada. I see you at the red light. KK Canada. I see you in the bar fight. KK Canada. My life and my ride. All of that matters. Tell you the truth, man. I just want my Canada.
Jesse Jackson and Al Sharpton do not deserve to be called civil rights leaders. They are not. They are hustlers and pimps who make a living off inflaming racial tensions.
Where did you get this?
Your friendly neighborhood anarchist.
More of an anarchist militant.
People involved in social struggles than everybody else.
People have been waiting for some content.
Radio.
Show.
The Final Straw, and I'm William Goodenough.
And I'm Percy Goodness.
The Final Straw Radio.noblogs.org.
If you're listening, you are the resistance.